This podcast is made possible by Vena.
Hello, this is Danielle McCrae. I am the CFO of Attack IQ, and you are listening to the CFO Thought Leader Podcast.
This is episode 783.
But then there was the external component. And so investor relations had a really strategic role at that moment of, we always interacted with our shareholders, but then we really had to convince our shareholders it's not worth it to take, if you think they're going to, purchase us for $85 or $90 or even $100 now, that's not worth it because we can do better down the line. So you're sitting there, you see how finance takes a really big role, and we had to do a whole investor day. And the interesting thing for me is just how big a role finance played in making that strategic decision. And then I think for me within it, from a career perspective, it ended up being a big opportunity because I developed very deep relationships across the company.
Hi, it's Jack. On today's show, we speak with Michael Kopelman, CFO of Meow. It was only last year that AT&T decided to leave the entertainment business and announced plans to relinquish its ownership of Time Warner, aka Warner Media. Not unlike many of his finance leader peers, the business headlines of the past have everything and nothing to do with the ups and downs of CFO Michael Kopelman's finance career. Turn back the clock 7 years, and Michael Kopelman was residing at the top of Time Warner's investor relations function, collaborating daily with its senior leaders to carefully execute the company's earnings communication process. Kopelman tells us it was pretty much business as usual until there came a knock on the door from an interested buyer. That story and much more on today's episode. We begin after this. Managing multiple spreadsheets, disconnected data, numbers you just can't trust. Your finance team can't be the strategic partner your organization needs right now with obstacles like that getting in your way. Vena can change that. Vena brings people, processes, and systems together in a single collaborative analytical platform so you can drive connected business planning and better decision making. And it's the only native Excel complete planning platform built for Microsoft 365 with Power BI embedded. With Vena, your financial and operational data is always connected, and your teams are always armed with insights and time to focus on what matters most. So when the stakes are high and the margin for error low, plan with agility, plan with resilience, plan with Vena so you can be prepared for whatever comes next. Visit venasolutions.com/planningaces to learn more about how Vena will help you plan for anything. Hello, we're speaking with Michael Kopelman, CFO of Meow. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Jack. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, we always begin by asking our guests to take a look back in time and try to identify where they believe they acquired the experience that allowed them to become a CFO. What were those places in time where there was some accelerated learning, perhaps? I don't know. What comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. It's always good to reflect back, and it strikes me that there are like two big areas that you need to be a CFO. And one, when you think about it functionally, is you need to learn stuff about finance, right? There's actual functional abilities and understandings that you need, and then there are things you need to learn about being a leader, right? And that both to lead the finance org, but as a CFO, you're also one of the senior executives at any company, and you're expected to be a leader of the company and to have input on decisions that are not just financial decisions. And so when I think back about my career, I really feel like almost every role I've had some component and some learning of both of those. And and I think about this, and it's this kind of interesting thread in my view, which is on the leadership side, so much of what I've learned has come about due to crisis, right? And I think that's I read this great HBR article on it, and it said, not founders, leaders aren't born, they're made, and they're really forged in crisis. And I feel like that's somewhat true. And I learned that pretty early in my career. I really started in equity research in San Francisco at a bank that no longer exists, Robertson Stevens. And Robbie was considered one of the four horsemen, as they were called, of tech investment banking in San Francisco. And I did that. I was a little bit older than some people when I started. I was almost 25, I think, when I started there at equity research. And I was so excited because I had really wanted to be in finance. I wanted to be, at an investment bank. And within a month of starting, we found out that the company was being put up for sale. And then about 6 months later, maybe 5 or 6 months later, I remember very vividly, I was sitting in my office and we all got an email like 102, 103, on the West Coast, the close of trading. And it said, please meet on the trading floors in San Francisco, in New York, London, all our trading floors. And we went in there and our president addressed us. And, he actually broke down and he said, I'm sorry to tell you, they decided to shut us down. And so I feel like it started in crisis. And I'm sitting there now and I'm kind of 6 months into what I thought was going to be my career at equity research. And now I don't know what I'm going to do. And I ended up finding a job at Merrill Lynch, also in equity research. And I think in both, what was interesting for me from a finance perspective and learning perspective in equity research, both at Robbie and Merrill, you really learn to think about the big industry trends, right? So you're on the outside, you're not learning how to operate, but you are learning about the big picture strategic stuff that happens in an industry. You're obviously learning how Wall Street works, what investors are looking for. You're interacting with investors. And then I had a ton of exposure to senior executives, right? So we got, at a very early stage in my career, I would go to meetings and I would be sitting with the CEO of CBS or Viacom. And so you got very comfortable asking questions and you already started to understand how people operated. So I ended up, like I said, I ended up at Merrill. And I think those were really important learnings that I've taken throughout my career and allowed me to be a better strategic partner. Once again, at Merrill, I encountered crisis. So I was at Merrill during the financial crisis in 2008. And so it seemed to be this thread. And I think what you learn both at Robertson, Stevens, and at Merrill, I was too junior to actively manage the crisis. But you start to realize that companies go through crisis. You normalize it a little bit, and it helps prepare you for being a leader, because so much of a leader is how you show up in those difficult moments, those challenging moments. And, and those are in so much of what you learn. So that crisis at Merrill, in some ways, and not just at Merrill, in the financial industry, is a big part of what ended up pushing me or, getting me to leave the industry. And I ended up taking a role in investor relations at Time Warner. And what was interesting for me is now I was still, I'm at the corporate level. And I think when I think about those functional things that you learn, I started to learn how companies operate a little bit, right? But at a pretty high level. We were a very large corporation. We had tens of thousands of employees, and I mostly was dealing with senior executives.
What intrigued me was, okay, so from Merrill Lynch, where you're in again equity research, you jump over to Time Warner in the investor relations function. You did cover media, so it's not a non-familiar company to you. And I would imagine might have been a relationship. I don't know. Was it executive search, or was there a connection there that you had, or?
No, it absolutely was a connection. And it's actually an interesting story. One of the things at Merrill, I was really lucky early in my career to have some great mentors and some great bosses. And my very first boss at Merrill was this woman, Whitney Johnson. And she actually hired me to do telecom and media, Latin American telecom and media. I ended up moving over to the US media team. And when we were in the middle of this crisis, and I kind of reached this point at Merrill, I've done research for 6 or 7 years, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I rightfully did not think that my boss was going to leave anytime soon. I actually, at that point, I was working for a woman by the name of Jessica Reef Cohen, who was a really truly like a legend on the street, and 10 times number one in institutional investor. And she's still there today, right? I was like, I don't know when Jessica's going to retire. She's still there. And I was thinking about it. And what Whitney told me, she said, Mike, why don't you think about the 5 people that you'd really like to work for? Write them down and then go find out a way to go work with them. One of the people on that list was John Martin, who was the CFO at Time Warner. And it just happened so that a role in investor relations opened up. So I went over there. I did know the team. I covered Time Warner, so it was an existing relationship. And I went there because I thought so highly of them. And they also, investor relations in some places, historically, particularly if you go back 20, 25 years, there was a little bit more of a comms function. But at Time Warner, it had always been a strategic function. That, when you look at what's happened with the people who were in that group, the CFO, John Martin, had run the group at one point. The person who succeeded him was a guy by the name of Jim Burtson. Jim's now the CFO of CAA. The person who succeeded Jim was Doug Shapiro, who ended up being my boss. He went on to run strategy at Time Warner. So it was always a strategic function. So I did have a relationship, and I knew that there was that opportunity internally to, come in investor relations, leverage what you've learned on the street, but then translate that into an operating role over time.
So just to clue our listeners in a little bit, you were at Merrill Lynch 6 years, you were at Time Warner 7 years. So you become, it looks like you climbed the ladder of the investor relations realm, and you become one of their rather senior investor relations people. How am I doing?
Yeah, no, you've got it right. I mean, it's funny, when I went into investor relations, and I think that, I mentioned it before, if I think about kind of crisis, the things that I'm learning, like how do you manage internally, how do companies manage budgets and stuff. So I learned a lot of that at Time Warner. I thought that I was going to be in investor relations for 3 years max. Then I would move on. And at 3 years, I was starting to get chomp at the bit. And then, I ended up taking over the group after about 5 years. And promptly we got thrown into crisis because there was Fox came with a hostile bid. And so once again, I have this moment where you see leadership and you see how to manage through crisis. And I think from a leadership perspective, you kind of get back to like, what do you learn about, how are you learning finance functions, but also how you're learning leadership? What always struck me about that process from a leadership perspective is that our CEO, Jeff Bewkes, was incredibly even-keeled throughout it. We were facing something that was kind of an existential crisis for the company, and Jeff never seemed phased. And I don't know that I've modeled it well, but I certainly have carried it with me, and I aspire to do that when I encounter those moments. So I ended up doing investor relations for about 7 years. And as a result of the relationships I built there, I ended up the head of HBO actually asked me to come over and join HBO. So HBO was one of our divisions. So I then went into a division role, and the idea was that I was going to go in, and it was a succession planning. The CFO at HBO was thinking about retiring, and so I was going to come in and work with him for a little bit, and then he was going to retire, and I was going to take over. And one of the things that I've seen throughout my career is that the best laid plans, right? You think things are going to happen, you've got to be prepared for the unpredictable. So a couple of months after I joined HBO, AT&T acquired us, or at least we announced the acquisition. It took a while to close, and then all those plans got upended. And so at that point, I spent a couple of years working, planning a strategy. And actually, for me, I think it was the first time that I really started getting into an operating role. And when I think about how do you prepare yourself to be a CFO, within the finance functions, you think about things like reporting and investor relations, but starting to get into that operating role, get close enough to the business that you can be a great business partner is really important. And HBO was the first time that I was getting close to it. We were still a pretty big company. We were, when I was at HBO, we were probably $5 billion in revenue. We had thousands of employees, but I was getting much closer to the business. After the AT&T acquisition, which is another, I don't want to say time of crisis, but certainly time of change, I ended up leaving. They wanted to put in somebody else, which is pretty normal in these situations, as CFO at HBO. And they asked me to go back to corporate. And I think the other tenet, of my career is I've always felt like I want to keep learning. how can I push myself forward? And at that point, I didn't feel like going back to corporate and getting further from the business again was the place where I was going to really, maximize my learning. So I ended up leaving. I didn't have a job at that point. And, I think the thing that worked out for me, I had built good relationships, and I went to see someone that I had worked with previously, had previously been at Time Warner, first as the CFO of AOL and then the CFO of Time Warner Cable, a guy by the name of Artie Mintz. And Artie was at this company, WeWork. And I knew very little about WeWork at the time. And I really didn't think I was going to go work there. I was just going to catch up with Artie. And I was talking to him about the sort of things I want to do. And Artie said, well, we need people like you here. Would you consider joining WeWork? And so little did I know what I was getting myself into, needless to say. But at the time, I was really interested in doing something outside of media, learning a new industry. I wanted to be in a high growth industry because I'd been in a slower growth industry. And so I ended up joining in a planning role. And that was a super interesting couple of years when I was at WeWork, and I started thinking about how I prepared myself to be a CFO because I got much closer to the operations. When you work at these really big companies, so much is already set up. There are so many layers. There's so much that happens, particularly if you're at a senior level. At WeWork, we were a big company when I joined. I think we were already at $1.5 billion in revenue, but we were doubling each year. But a lot of the stuff that existed at big companies didn't exist. And I was much closer to those operating decisions. So the sort of things that I learned there that prepared me for the CFO role, we did a systems implementation, right? When I got there, we were doing planning, which is crazy for a company of our size, but we were doing planning in Excel, right? We implemented a planning tool. We implemented a reporting tool. But I also was involved in pricing decisions and in sales compensation plans, things that if you had asked me when I was at Time Warner, theoretically I was working in the company and I worked in finance, I had no idea how our advertising salespeople were compensated. How were their plans set up? I had never seen one. So now you really start to get closer to the business. And I think that has been really helpful. That kind of progression as I gotten increasingly more operational makes you a much better business partner and has really helped prepare me to be a CFO. The other thing that happened at WeWork is once again, I found myself, I reacquainted myself with crisis. So I was there for 2 years. The first year was the hyper growth, and I was just learning about how do you manage growth at scale? How do you set up the systems and stuff? And then the second year was really about crisis management, right? How do we deal with, we had planned on, and I think it's been well reported that we were going to IPO the company and then we're going to use it to help fund growth. And suddenly those plans changed. And so we needed to quickly raise money, in an alternative fashion. We needed to slow down growth. We needed to cut expenses. And so that was a really intense period of learning and of opportunity, right? For me, in terms of learning, it was painful at times, but there are some great lessons that came out of it. And I think really prepared me for stuff that was to come. And of course, right after we kind of got out of one crisis, COVID hit, right? So then we had our second crisis, which is how do we manage through this? And, we have a physical business. It's built on people coming to the office when no one's going to the office anymore, right?
Let me just ask you one WeWork question. I'm sorry. Indulge me here. Just wondering, just because it did make quite a few headlines. Do you remember the day when the IPO was pulled?
I do remember the day that when the IPO was pulled. Yeah, I mean, this was so I was in our office. We had, it's not. If you kind of look back at that time, there was a whole lead up to the IPO being pulled, right? And so it was, first, there were a bunch of negative headlines and how do we respond to them? There were some challenging investor meetings. So I probably, it wasn't quite as much of a shock to some of us as to like maybe the overall company, but so I remember it quite vividly. And I think more than anything, I remember, what happens after that, which is kind of the aftermath of like, okay, how are we going to do this now? How do we go forward? And so I think that was, I think back about, for me, I reflect on the team and how people rallied, right? And it really, it was a really challenging period. And what I took away from it in terms of how we executed as a finance team is that we had such strong relationships with each other, I think, within the team, and people cared so much about what we were doing that they were really willing to move heaven and earth because as hard as the team had been working during the IPO process, we suddenly were thrown into this process where we had to work maybe even harder, right? And we really, we were now like, how are we going to raise billions of dollars in an alternative fashion in a very short period of time? So it was, kind of, one moment of mourning, and then how do we pivot and actually resolve this situation? And I'm really eternally grateful for what my team and the broader finance org did during that period, because they pushed themselves to the limit at times to try to make sure that the company would survive. And I think a lot of great relationships that have come out of that, and a lot of learnings about what you can achieve as a team when you have each other's back and you believe in each other, and when you need to.
It's it's a controversial chapter as well. The S1 did raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I joined, the two things that I would say is like a lot of this stuff, because obviously there's been a lot written about WeWork. I think I joined later stage, right? So there was I would say a lot of the craziness probably happened a little bit earlier in that period. Some of the lessons that I took away from it beyond the team, for me is just the importance of focus, the importance of org structure, right? I think it's really one of the things that happened, and the importance of systems, right? And those really stuck with me. I think one of the challenges for us as companies, they grew so fast and it was so broad in terms of what it was trying to achieve. We didn't really have the right systems and the right org structure to function at that scale, right? And so I think that was a lesson. And so I really took with me when I ended up leaving WeWork, one of the things I really wanted to do was have a chance to go somewhere that was early enough. I really enjoyed high growth. I really enjoyed the places where people were aligned around a mission. I wanted to go somewhere where we were early enough in my career where I could try to build things the right way, right? How do you actually implement systems early enough? How do you build the org so that it functions, so you have the right business partnering? And that's where I ended up joining Maven Clinic. And I think for me, that was kind of the last step. And I took over as CFO, but when I talk about getting really deeply operational, at this point, I joined a company that was only 130 people. So, when I joined WeWork, we probably had 8,000 people already. It was a pretty sizable company at that
What
point.
also is interesting here is you have really left media now. You went to WeWork. That's sort of where you broke the ties. And then Maven Clinic, which it's no longer media.
Yeah, and one of the things I would say is that when I left, so two thoughts. So first of all, Maven Clinic is a digital health company. It's the leading digital health company focused on women and families. And it was we were a Series C startup when I started. We've subsequently done a Series D, and I guess there was a Series E, I think, shortly after I left. So it's kind of later stage, high growth company, very mission driven, an awesome company with an awesome team. With a really fantastic mission to try to improve care for women and families, right? Improve the standard of care for women and families. I was primarily attracted to the fact that it was mission driven. I was kind of interested in healthcare. It's such a large part of our economy. There's so much discussion around it. And so I was fascinated about the opportunity to actually get to learn about that. And then for me, I think more than anything is what I said, I wanted that chance to build in an early stage and see if we could build something that was lasting and durable and have that experience. And that was a really phenomenal experience, that part of it when I joined. So it was intentional to kind of answer your question about, I intentionally, not because I didn't like media, and I'm going to get back to that because I actually loved media. I love being a creative business, but I was interested in exploring other stuff. And, I really, I spent a couple of years at Maven Clinic. We grew the business, 5 or 6x in that time. When I started, it's just kind of, I said we had 130 people overall. There were 2 people in finance the day before I started, right? So we built the entirety of the finance org. We put in systems, we put in budget process, we built out all the function. I hired our first controller. We brought on we did our first Big Four audit. All of these things in a couple of years that I was there, and I was really grateful for the opportunity. And I'm friends with a lot of the team there. I think ultimately for me, it turns out that I didn't love healthcare, and I really missed being a part of a creative business. And so it's one of those things that I have kind of come around to the conclusion over the course of my career that you are a better finance partner if you are really passionate about the industry you're in. I'm not saying you can be very good in finance and you can be very effective in putting in the right process, the right systems, and you can do all those things functionally, well. But when you really are interested deeply in the business and the industry, it allows you to be a much better partner. And so when I ended up leaving Maven Clinic, one of the things that I was really focused on is how can I get back to being in a creative business? I really missed, after, spending 4 years outside of it, I missed being part of the creative business. And I love, there's a nuance when you work in a creative business around finance. I know you've probably over the years, you've interviewed a lot of different CFOs, and you think about the metrics people talk about. Sometimes it feels more like a science than an art. But when you work in a creative business, there's a real balance, right? Because we need process and structure within finance, but we also need to balance, how do we make sure we're not snuffing out creativity? How are we creating a place for these unbelievably talented artists to create their best work? And that's something that I felt like I really learned when I was at HBO. When we think about preparing myself for Meow work, there was a reverence for the storyteller at HBO. The mission there was really be the vehicle for people to come and do their best work. And when I started talking to Meow Wolf, and the very first time I talked to Jose Tolosa, who's our CEO, I was really struck by that vision and that similarity. And I was really excited about the prospect of getting back and working with creatives. I love being able to help creatives, execute their vision.
Well, this is a great segue for us. Let's find out about Meow Wolf. What does this company do, and what are its offerings, really?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it is, I think the first thing to know about Meow Wolf, it is a deeply creative place. It was started by artists who really wanted a vehicle to share their vision with the world. And what it is what they ended up creating was an interactive, immersive art experience. We do physical locations. We have 3 of them today, one in Santa Fe, one in Denver, one in Vegas. We recently announced that we're going to be opening our next one in Grapevine in Dallas Fort Worth this summer, and we've got more in the works. And I think the thing that's really unusual and special about Meow Wolf and the experience is that the whole purpose when people come is to have this vehicle for artists, but also to inspire creativity and thoughtfulness in people. And so when people come into our space, there's an underlying narrative. There are different worlds you can explore, but there's no map. We don't tell people how to experience it. What we want them to do is start to realize that, and it's great if you go to like Omega Mart, which is our location in Vegas, you start in a grocery store, right? And what feels like a grocery store, but when you start inspecting a little bit more closely, you realize it's not quite what you think it is. There's the milk carton has a handle on it, and that vegetable, you think it's a root vegetable, but it's a plushie. And then you open the freezer door, and it's not a freezer at all. It's a door into another universe. And then you walk through, and you're in a totally different space. You're no longer in a grocery store. And the whole ethos is, how do we get people to think differently about the world? How do we have this transformative journey for them to take them out of their day-to-day and think about the possibilities and inspire creativity and the art of thinking about the possible in the world? And it's just it's a wonderful vision. And if you go experience it, for me personally, when I walk into one of our spaces, that moment where I walk from one world into the next and I go back I always find them that moment magical. And the other thing for us is that you really get up close and personal with art, and you can see this is not, these are experiences, but they're not these aren't mass manufactured. These are handcrafted experiences that are built by our artists, and you can see it. You can see their handiwork. Like I say, you can see the hand of the artist there, and you can really feel that connection. And so I also have had the privilege of, I go to our facility in Santa Fe, and I see the passion that they have with it, and I see the creativity, and then I can see how that translates into our exhibits. And our mission is to bring that sense of creativity and inspire creativity throughout the
So
world.
will consumers pay a fee to enter this environment, these different environments? Are they paying at the door, or how does it work exactly?
Yeah, so they're ticketed experiences. So you pay, you buy a ticket, like you would to other, let's call it location-based entertainment or attractions. So you go in, and so you go in and you explore. Once you're in, it's not timed. We don't tell you where to go. There's no like, go through here, do it. You come in the entrance, and then you explore and discover on your own. But it's a ticketed experience.
Could you give us maybe an abbreviated history of the capital structure? What would you share with us?
Yeah, this is actually fun. I think you probably don't hear many more interesting kind of founding stories. So it was, when you go back in the history, it was started by a number of artists. And, if you look at the early days, crowdfunding, they had some small amounts of early, venture and, local investors. But when they really wanted to create a permanent exhibition, one of the founders, Vince Calderbeck, had this idea of buying a bowling alley in Santa Fe. And of course, it was, they didn't have the money to do it. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, is a resident of Santa Fe. And Vince had met him. And Vince ended up going and pitching him on the idea of buying the bowling alley so that Meow Wolf could create this installation there. And so that actually, George did that. And that is our first site. And so George was an early supporter of the company. And since then, they did some other rounds, but we ended up taking, we're still a private company. We took money from a private equity company. It's a really, really phenomenal partner in this that believes so deeply in what our artists are doing. And they had spent a lot of time kind of looking at immersive entertainment and different location-based entertainment. I think when they found Meow Wolf, what they realized was that this was a deeply creative place that was creating something truly distinctive, a different experience. And they've been really phenomenal partners. So they're the majority owners today.
And over the next 3 years, should we expect multiple locations to be added, or?
Yeah, so we've got 2 under construction right now, and we're actively looking for more. So we're absolutely, I think for us, the opportunity to to have more visitors come through, to inspire more people, but also to employ more artists and give more artists a vehicle to share their vision with the world is something that we're really excited about. So absolutely, we're looking all across the country. And so, yeah, we definitely would, expect to continue to expand the business.
And is it pre-revenue, or?
Yeah, no, we're, one of the nice things about being private is we don't have to share too much, but no, we do generate, we have millions, we had millions of visitors last year, and people pay $40, $50+ to come to our exhibits. So no, we generate meaningful revenue, in the locations themselves, are profitable. We're reinvesting the money back in, right, into the business and into growth and into the opportunity, into producing more art, right? So that's what we're focused on now. How do we? So
Are the artists employed by the company, or is it a different type of setup or model?
yeah, so we do. It's both. We absolutely employ artists. We have a significant contingent of artists that are they were early employees. They're still part of the company. So we have a large group of people based in Santa Fe in a large workshop there that they work out of. We also, for us, the community engagement is really critical when we go into any new city, and we want to make sure it reflects that local artistic community. So we partner with local artists, both bringing some of them who help work on the permanent what I'll call the permanent, exhibition, but we also bring in rotating, temporary exhibitions with local artists. And that partnership is really important to us as we think about how we integrate ourselves into the community. It's worth noting we're a B Corp. So we think about these things more broadly, right? And I know you asked about profitability. One of the nice things I think for all of us is that yes, we want to, financials. I'm a CFO. They matter for a variety of reasons, but it's not the only consideration we have. We do think about the impact we have in the community, the impact we have in the environment, what the social impact is, how we engage with our employees. And so it's very important for us that we do have that local input and those local ties everywhere we go.
Now, as far as we always talk about lines of sight and being able to see into the business, one would imagine that, again, you mentioned two new sites that are being developed. The capital investment that'll need to be made there, the employees who will be required to help operate the properties. I mean, these are all things that you clearly will need to be involved with going forward. And again, you joined the company late last year, I imagine.
I did. I'm just a few months into this, so I'm still, I'm still, I would say more or less drinking from the fire hose. But yeah, it's true. We make significant capital investments into our locations, and so it takes us multiple years to build these. Like these are long term, just from negotiation all the way through concept phase, and the creative, the inspiration from the artist all the way through execution. We actually need to build them, and so we do have long term. We think in years about how we're planning, right? Particularly for our projects, and I think that's one of the things actually that I'm really excited about to come in is to, we've always thought about our projects in years, but I want us to think about our enterprise in years. And what I found to be very effective from a finance perspective and how we become great partners and we create a common language is to think, where do we want to, I like the future back. How do we look out 5 years? What do we want the company to look like from an operating perspective, from a social impact perspective, from a financial perspective? Once we align on that as a team, it's much easier to make good decisions along the way because we have that North Star and where we're trying to go. And so I'm really excited for us to do some of that work in the coming months.
All right. Well, we're up to our finance strategic moment question, which is when we ask you to look back across the span of your career and try to identify a moment where you had a strategic insight that led you to pursue a risk, pursue a risk, avoid a risk, pursue an opportunity, make a change in course, whatever it might have been, a course correction, whatever it might have been. Anything come to mind when we ask for a finance strategic moment?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things, but the thing that strikes me is that, I mentioned before that in these moments, I feel like you learn so much in the moments of crisis, right? And that's a big part of who you are is, what you need to bring to the table as a leader is making sure that you're prepared for that and how you show up during those moments. And I think one of the things that's hit me is that invariably in those moments of crisis, finance comes to the fore, right? Suddenly, finance becomes very important. And so I think back when I was at Time Warner, I had been about 6 or 7 months after I took over as head of investor relations, we got an unsolicited bid from a competitor. And this really, and I mentioned before, this sent us into kind of it was a moment of reflection for the company. And that point, from a finance perspective, we needed to look at and say, would we be better off as a company pursuing a sale, or do we think we're going to be better off operating on our own? Can we do better operating on our own and maybe pursuing strategic alternatives down the line than we can through selling? And it was a really fascinating moment because you build these long-term plans within an org, and everyone uses them and the reference points. But when you come to that decision, suddenly those financial plans become really critical, and you really start pulling them apart and you examine them. What can we do? How are we going to do it? How committed are we to doing it? How confident are we going to do it? And those fundamentally a lot of those are financial questions, but with a big strategic overlay. And so I've found that those moments where, where finance, and you kind of ask for a finance strategic moment, where finance has the biggest impact is where you can use your financials and the financial plans to drive strategic decision making. And ultimately, the decision of of the leadership team, but also of the board, was that the standalone plan we had was a better plan and would result in a better outcome than pursuing a sale at that time. And there were a bunch of things that went into it, including whether or not it was the right time to sell the company, whether there might be other acquirers down the line. We ultimately did sell the company down the line, but it was an interesting moment for me to see how important finance was. And the interesting thing was there was the internal component about our financial plan, but then there was the external component. And so investor relations had a really strategic role at that moment of, we always interacted with our shareholders, but then we really had to convince our shareholders it's not worth it to take, if you think they're going to, purchase us for 85 or 90 or even $100 now, that's not worth it because we can do better down the line. So you're sitting there, you see how finance takes a really big role, and we had to do a whole investor day. And the interesting thing for me is just how big a role finance played in making that strategic decision. And then I think for me within it, from a career perspective, it ended up being a big opportunity because I developed very deep relationships across the company. And I mentioned that the head of HBO asked me to come work with them. Our relationship was really forged during that crisis. We worked very closely together around what our strategic plan should look like and how we do it. So I think from a company perspective, that was a strategic moment where we had to think about it, and finance had such an important role in it. And then for me personally, it was a real moment of opportunity. And you think about those moments where you have a chance to step up and take a leadership role, and that fundamentally changed my trajectory, because it was the step for me away from Wall Street. It's the final step, because I had been, I started in research and I was in investor relations. You're working at a company, but you're still very much, you're still interacting with Wall Street. And then I really moved into an operating role after that.
Hello and welcome to 60-Second Stories from CFO Thought Leader. Back in 1993, Don Alvarez was an auditor with Deloitte's San Francisco office when specialty retailer and coveted client company West Marine went public. For Alvarez, the day entailed West Marine's management taking the novel steps to price its offering, followed by a trip to a Bay Area printer. The long day turned into a long night, so there was little hesitation on Alvarez's part when West Marine's CFO offered him a lift back to the accounting house's office. Still, the night turned out to have even more to offer the young auditor when West Marine's CFO suddenly pulled his car over and offered Alvarez a controller role at the newly public company. Alvarez offered a yes on the spot, allowing him to advance down the CFO path. That story and much more on episode number 867 of CFO Thought Leader. Remember, the future of finance is listening.
We're going to jump to our mentoring round, where I want you to look back and think back to that first time you stepped into a CFO role. That would have been at the Maven Clinic. There was something you wish someone had told you. If you could go back in time, what would it be? That's when, all the CFO responsibilities first fell on your shoulders. What is that piece of advice you would have given yourself if you could go back?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's always good to keep in mind. It's just because I've just started another new role and think about it. And I think the first thing is, make sure, that you don't skimp on your team. First, think about org building. And, any CFO is only as good as the team they have around them. And so make sure that, I think one of the challenges that I ended up having at Maven Clinic, and I think this is when you're in hyper growth, you need to make sure that the finance team is keeping up with the rest of the org. And that can be difficult. We're finance people. We like to be disciplined. We want to set a good example for the rest of the org. I woke up about a year in and I realized that the org had grown, massively. And we weren't set up from a business partnering perspective to support that growth, right? So I really just, first of all, make sure that you are set up and resourced to be a great partner. And you're only going to be as good as your team. And the second thing that I would say, you mentioned all the responsibilities you take on. When you get there, you may not have a natural mentor anymore, right? A CEO doesn't necessarily know what the CFO's roles, should be or what they should do. They haven't necessarily lived through it. So I would really, I would tell people that they should go out and make sure that they have a support network. I have, I'm part of a group. I ended up, it took me about a year before I joined one, but I'm part of a group called Then Wise, which is a support group for different operators, but mine is only CFOs. And we meet a couple of times a month, and we talk about our problems, and we suggest solutions to each other. So I think finding whatever the vehicle is, go find that support group that you can go ask questions to, because the jobs they're hard and they can be lonely. And so, it's important to find that support.
So we always like to ask our guests to reflect a little bit on the personal side for us. We're wondering if you have a personal habit or part of a daily routine, something that you do that kind of sets you apart, something people point out every once in a while. Probably a family member might be more familiar with you than perhaps a colleague. But does anything come to mind when we ask for a personal habit or part of a routine that you have?
Well, I'm gonna say two things here. One is something that I do personally, but it is professional, which is, I'll just tell you, I believe so much of what we do in our careers is relationship driven. And I think it's, I've never regretted going and spending time with people in the company, getting out in the field. I think going out and talking to operators. And so I think it's so important that you build those relationships. I've never once regretted it. You always learn something. If you go to one of our exhibitions, when I was at HBO, if I went out and talked to, the production team in Santa Monica, when I was at Time Warner, I would go out to, to the studio, to the Warner Brothers studio. You always learn something. And so I always felt like going out and talking to the operating teams is really valuable. I do one thing that may be a little bit quirky on the personal side. I do personal OKRs. So I don't know if you're familiar with OKRs, but objectives and key
Sure.
results. It's
Yeah.
a goal setting process that a lot of tech companies use, and I've found that to be a very effective system for me personally to keep me on track. I talk to my wife about them and I share them. So I found that to be very useful personally.
So what would be an objective, a personal objective, if we're not invading your privacy too much here?
No, not at all. I'll give you some. Look, I wanted to spend at least 1 hour a day on one of my personal interests, right? And I play tennis. I wanted to get back into trying to learn the piano again, but I just wanted. So I've committed to that. One time I said that, I wanted. One of them was like in the next 3 months, I want to make sure that I see in some way or interact with like at least 90% of the people that I consider like really important in my life. Right. So, set up sometimes I set weight goals, they're different things.
What about a book selection? Anything come to mind for us? Doesn't have to be a business book. It might be something you escape with. Anything?
Yeah. The thing that so I'm going to give a genre and I'll give a couple of titles, but anything that's related to probabilistic thinking. Like for me, the books that that have really changed the way I view the world are ones that, have you thinking about and considering the world probabilistically. So the very first one that I read on this is Fooled by Randomness, by an author by the name, he's a well-known person, Nassim Taleb. I sometimes wince when saying, because Taleb can be a little bit of a controversial figure. But another one that I read recently was Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, who's a former professional poker player. And when you start viewing the world probabilistically, it will change everything. And I think about my personal life differently, but you really professionally as a finance person, I think it's really helpful, right? And I think about forecasting differently. I think about scenario planning differently. It's all, I think about sometimes I think about performance differently, right? You can, all day when you look at something, it's like, I believe we make a decision because we make an investment because we think there's an 80% probability that it'll work. And then under that sort of construct, it's going to have a good return. 20% of the time it's going to fail, right? It's not going to meet it if you look at that properly. And when you go back and look at that, you want to understand, was it a poor choice, right? Or was it just that the range of outcomes, it ended up falling in somewhere in that curve that was not what I had hoped for. And so I think it's really, I like to be within my career, and I like orgs to be, kind of process driven. And so I know people like to say, well, we want to be results oriented to a degree, but I do, you've got to understand sometimes you can make the right decisions and the results don't follow. So there's a balance. And I think understanding that is really helpful, particularly in finance.
Okay, well, we're up to our final question where we ask you to look forward finally, and we're interested in learning your priorities as a finance leader over the next 12 months. What are your priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I referenced a little bit of this earlier. What I'd really like for us as an org to do and to work with the rest of the team on is setting that 5-year vision. Where are we going to go? What are the North Stars? What are those things that we can future back so that when we get into things like budgeting process, it makes life much easier. We've already all agreed where we want to go. Now it's just about how we get there. And so I think that's really, really helpful from an alignment perspective. So that's, one thing from a big picture, how do we partner with the rest of the org? I think the second thing that I would like to do is for us, we're putting in, foundational systems as a finance org. So I want to make sure we execute that really well. And if you want to be a high functioning finance organization in this day and age, you've got to have great systems. We're putting in a new ERP. We're putting in a planning tool. I want to make sure that we do that well, that our team is trained well on it, that we bring the rest of the org along for that ride. And that's going to be really critical to our ability to function long term. And then I'd really like us to focus on business partnering. I want to make sure that we are a trusted partner for the org, right? Ultimately in finance, we put in controls and other process, but what we really want to do is be a great partner in helping the rest of the org make good decisions, right? And so we need to make sure that we win that trust. So I'm really focused on that as I come into this role.
Michael Kopelman, thank you for joining us on CFO Thought Leader.
Thanks, Jack. It's been a pleasure.
Hello, Thought Leader listeners. As you have perhaps already heard or even seen, we're now featuring the career lessons and moments of strategic insight shared by our CFO guests as Thought Leader videos. You can now find these videos on our blog at cfothoughtleader.com and, of course, our newsletters, but also on LinkedIn. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow our CFO Thought Leader LinkedIn company page, and you'll be certain not to miss a single Thought Leader video debut. CFO Thought Leader, the #1 thought leadership platform exclusively for and by CFOs. As always, thank you for listening.